hear me on the live stream. If you can't, right, just put a comment in and I will check this and fix the audio. So before we get started on the Civil Liberties chapter and why this monitor is turning on, before exam one, you're going to be expected to read. Hopefully that's not overlapping too much. You're going to be expected to read this text. This is state versus state, right? Not all of it, but chapters 1 and 2. If you have not gotten this yet, right, we need to talk because this is not a textbook, right? If you can look at it, and I don't know if people can see, right, that it's written as a narrative, right? It's a story, right? But it's a story of Nevada, right? So it's got a lot of historical references. When they're talking about it, it's not always clear what's important. So I'm going to lecture on this, right? And I'm going to talk about some stuff, but the slides aren't as helpful as the slides in the We the People files, right? The We the People PowerPoint is straightforward because it is a textbook. But with this text, it's a much more narrative storytelling way of learning. And so I'm going to go over it, but make sure you look at it and say, okay, what's relevant, right? What is the parts that matter? I don't ask you any names in this exam. I don't ask you to know anyone's name because I don't think Governor Nye or Brigham Young or those people, those aren't what I'm asking you about. I want to ask you about political science questions. So what is it about this founding that matters, right? Why were we here in the first place, right? We didn't just open a casino and then that was the beginning, right? Why were we here? What were the reasons that why we were here, right? As you're reading this. So when I lecture on this, I'm going to expect more questions. Because this is Nevada and the Nevada Constitution requirement is 25% of the grade, about 25% of exam 1 is this first 2 chapters, right? So even if you've really been studying We the People, if you don't go through this and make sure you understand these first 2 chapters, 25% of the exam is going to be very difficult, right? So just be prepared for that. Okay, so if you're live streaming this, or if you're going to be watching this video, now would be where you would open up the PowerPoint to Civil Liberties. That's right. That's what you expected today. I hope. Assignment 2 was posted. I wanted to change things a bit because I was still going off of an older edition. So I went back through and I didn't like how there wasn't as much clear overlap. It used to be really easy because if you're like, I'm not sure about a term, you could just go to the margins of the old books and they would give you the actual definition. That's not true anymore with the essentials, but the essential is so much cheaper, right? It's like $100 difference. It's not worth $100 for you to buy this bigger book. You shouldn't have to do that. And I didn't ask you to do that, right? I said you could have an older edition or a digital edition or whatever. Because of that, right, I changed the question to fit better with what I've covered, right? Or what I will cover. So I want to make sure that we're overlapping. So the assignments are going to change, so they're going to come up more. Instead of just having them all available right away, I want to edit them because I went back through, and there are a lot of things that Dr. Bowers changed. Right? Dr. Bowers wrote this book, The State First State, and he teaches here. But he changed his mind about mine taxation. It's a little bit of a tweak in what he wrote, but because of that, it makes it seem like he's coming to a different conclusion to me. Right, and if I'm reading this and I'm analyzing this as a graduate student who has a master's degree, who has been in school for a long time, who has read this book several times, then it might be confusing to you, right, about what his clear direction is. So whenever we defer, right, I do want you to read this, I want you, but whenever I defer from the text, right, remember I wrote the exam. Whether that's fair or not is irrelevant. I wrote the exam, so the answers fit with what I believe are the right answers, right? Even if there's a little bit of a difference. And I'm going to explain to you when we do that the differences that I expect. Exam 1, I'm giving you 72 hours to take. It will be open because it's supposed to be on the 15th, which I believe is next Tuesday. You have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I believe, to take it. So it's an online exam. We will not have class that day. And on Thursday, we're going to start late too, but that's for an administrative reason. For that exam, right, it is 40 questions. It's actually 41 questions, but the 41st question is sort of to give me sort of a little bit of extra credit just for you to know that you're done, right? So you're gonna have 40 questions, they're randomized, the answers are randomized. So if you're sitting next to someone, your 17 is not their 17, right? Just trying to make sure that I eliminate any realistic possibility for you to cheat, right? There isn't really a lot of opportunity other than asking someone else that you can cheat. It's open note, it's open book, right? Whatever resources you have other than another human being is fine. If you want to Google, if you whatever you want to do, if you want to put all the PowerPoints together and Control F through it to try and look for stuff, every resource that you can possibly come up with other than asking another human being is acceptable, right? When you're taking the exam. You have 72 hours to do the exam, but when you open the exam, you have 50 minutes, exactly 50 minutes. I have to look through this, but for most of you, you will have 50 minutes. There are 40 questions. The questions sometimes are difficult, but remember you have everything available to you. What will happen to you is that you're going to hit a question. And if you're like, I'm not sure, I don't do this thing where you can't go back. All the questions will be right there. So you can just be like going through, these are the ones I know, and then go back to the ones that maybe you weren't sure about, right? This is a lot of professors now are like, no, you have to answer this question and then you can't go back. I think that's nonsense. You should, if you run into a question and you're like, I don't know the answer to this, I don't know anything about this, don't worry about that question. Answer all the questions that you feel confident about and then go back. And I promise if you do it that way, you'll have enough time to do it. But if you hit a question you don't know and then you waste 10 minutes trying to figure out what that question means, that's 10 minutes lost, right? And it's only worth, right, 1/20th or 1/40th the total exam value, right? So make sure when you're taking this at home, because I'm not here in the room, you can't really ask me questions during, and because it's over this long 72-hour window, you might take it when I'm asleep or when I'm just not available. There won't be an opportunity to ask someone for help. So when you're going through that process, make sure that you answer the questions that you know and then go back. And that is a much more effective process. And it's a much better learning tool. What can I do now? And later I'll attack this thing once I've thought about it while I'm going through the other ones. Because a lot of these questions are going to be very simple. How long is a senator elected for? How long is a person in the House of Representatives elected for, right? What ratio does it take to ratify an amendment, right? What ratio of the states to take to ratify an amendment? What are these basic things about government? What is the term that describes when a small group of people, right? Because most of you have seen the assignment too. Some of you have done it. So these are things that are basic government things that you should know. So when you hit a hard question, remember that I know it was a hard question, right? I changed the difficulty level of the questions. That availability is there. Okay, so let me check okay, if there are any questions, just let me know. Yeah, yes. Normally when I teach, I have a little more essays. Because this is an intro course, we're going to start with multiple choice. There might be some extra credit short answer, but the expectation of you as taking a 101 course is to not have like that skill set of critical analysis yet. Why are you forced to take this 101, right? We want you to understand government, but this and other humanities that you're forced to take is to develop those critical analysis skills. So I don't want to test you on something that we haven't given you an opportunity to really do. And because this is a lecture class, right, I don't really open it up for discussion very often, right? Mostly because it's a hybrid online. But because there's no discussion, you're not really having an opportunity to voice what you believe and what you think, right? And then have it tested against my facts and the arguments that I'm going to make, and then introduction to the class. That's something that you're not getting yet. Hopefully you will get over time. And then when you're like taking 200 and 300 level courses, then that's going to be a critical class expectation. But that won't be anything except extra credit until for this semester, except the paper, which I will work with you, right? I'm trying to develop it. That's why it's a paper, not an exam, because I want to see you write something. If you're worried, write a draft, submit a draft, and that's the only time where there will be some writing involved. And that is allowed, right? If you submit it to me early, you can resubmit it 100 times. I don't care. I'll always edit it. Not edit it, but I would always tell you what you need to do to make it better, and then I'll give it back to you, and then you can give it back to me, right? I don't believe in this, let's just do it and see what grade I get. I should allow you to fail and then allow you to come back from that failure, right? Just because of ex-military, right? Failure, recovery, do better, then succeed, right? That's the best learning tool that I had, right? My bias is set up that way, so that'll happen. In these exams, unfortunately, multiple choice, just get through it, but I have to have some metric to go against to see whether or not you're picking up the material. Okay, are there any other questions right now? Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Right, for those of you, I gotta get better about this, right? That there won't be any, all the exams in this semester will be multiple choice. All right, so let's talk about civil liberties, right? I believe we talked about a government, federalism, right? We are a federal government, right? But we're also a constitutional government. And civil liberties, right, at the bottom, right? This is not as organized as I remember. There are these parts of your life that the government is not allowed to interfere with, right? And then, okay. And I want you to think about these as negative freedoms. It is not that you have, we'll talk about, after this exam, we're gonna go into what are called civil rights. And those are positive freedoms. Negative freedoms are things that the government can't interfere with. Not that someone should protect you from, right? This is, civil liberties are the government specifically cannot interfere in these areas. People might, right? But the government cannot, right? We already talked about the Bill of Rights, right? Or we haven't talked about the Bill of Rights exclusively. We talked about the Bill of Rights as a sort of concept. The First Amendment says there's no establishment of religion, right? Because it says there's no establishment of religion, right? That means the government cannot tell you what to believe in your religion, right? It can't tell you what religion to practice. It can't force you to go, right? I cannot lead prayer in this classroom because that would be me acting as a government official, right? I'm hired by the state, right? Forcing that upon me, right? So this is a negative freedom because I can't interfere in these aspects of your life. And this is what's going to really matter, is that because we're a constitutional government, civil liberties provide limits on what the government can do. And when you provide limits on what the government can do, it has a lot of implications about the behavior of the citizens, right? Citizens have different behavior in the United States than other places. We already talked about this with the masks, right? The United States is having more of a problem about wearing a mask than other countries because we have a history of civil liberties. I have rights, the government can't tell me what to do. When you have that belief that the government can't tell you what to do, one of those aspects is that it's not always clear where that line is. Can the government tell you to wear a mask, right? Now, we might someday find out that the courts decided that the mandate was unconstitutional. But right now, the belief in the court system is that this is not a protected right. You not wearing protective gear is not a right. And we know that because of bicycle helmets, right? We know that because of protective gear and seatbelts. The government can make you do things to protect yourself, right? Seatbelt laws and helmet laws and all sorts of other laws that to protect you. They get that from police power, right? They have a right to make laws and enforce those laws for your safety, right? So the masks feel like they're constitutional, but later in life, right, I'm sure a lot of this will end up going to the courts. And to get to a Supreme Court, it takes years. So we'll be far out of this pandemic, right? And they'll still be having court cases about what is the legal status of it, right? It's a longer process. One of the first aspects, right, before the Bill of Rights was this idea about what happens to you when you get arrested. There was a practice, right, and we call them the admiralty courts during the colonial rule, that you could be arrested and just told that you were guilty, right? That there was no trial, that there was no group of peers that voted or that decided your fate, right? That you just had a judge who worked directly for the crown, right? And then we just decide guilt, but that guilt would be decided about how much it mattered to the crown, right? Will my king be happy that I found you guilty? Not are you guilty, but is this the will of the king that you were guilty, right? And this creates two things, right? The first is this habeas corpus, right? And this becomes this American principle because of the admiralty courts. If you arrest me, or if you say that I'm going to be put into custody for some reason, there has to be some sort of reason that I was retained, right? You have to show the cause of detention, right? This happens a lot, right? This is why we have such a problem today, because a police officer will approach someone and they say, why are you stopping me, right? That's actually a very American principle, right? Today, it's very problematic, right, because we're concerned about racial bias or about treatment, or that police are violating this habeas corpus or this Fourth Amendment right by just walking up people and demanding that they discuss with them, right? As Americans, you have a right not to talk to a police officer, right? You have your Fifth Amendment right of self-incrimination, which we'll talk about. But habeas corpus is, if they do arrest you, they have to tell you why they're arresting you, right? Which is why it's so problematic of what we're dealing with today, right? This is an American principle. You can't arrest someone without explaining what they are. And there has to be a court order saying they're going to be arrested. The courts decide who gets arrested, not the police force, right? Now, right, obviously, there's some enforcement mechanisms there. Then the United States, right, in its founding, decided that you can't just decide someone's guilty. And the language that they use is called a bill of attainder. A bill of attainder says you are guilty before a trial, right? Admiralty courts would create this bill of attainder, which is just a document, and then they would give that to some enforcement agency, right, whoever it was, some sort of sheriff or whatever belonged in that period of time. And then that individual who worked for the crown would go and arrest that person and put them in jail. Done. Right? That person is convicted and sentenced. They never actually see a court. They just give them the bill of attainder, right? Then they're placed to do it. They don't have to be explained why they're going to jail, right? So the reason why Americans reject that so much is because it was happening more and more often. And what you always see when you have a power struggle is the people getting arrested were the people fighting for independence, or there are people that were talking about having representation, right? Political dissidents. When you have political dissidents being arrested, right, all Americans would agree that you can't just arrest your political opponents, but this was happening in the colonies because they weren't being treated as citizens. So a part of our foundational ideals was you have to be told why you're being arrested, and there has to be some reason, and there has to be a trial, which we'll talk about as we go through the amendments. Then what would happen, right, which normally happens in authoritarian regimes, if you have what's called ex post facto laws, is you pass a law that says something is illegal, right? This happened in the United States when, this is a small side note, until about the 1980s, there was no crime. It was not a crime, not the 1980s, excuse me, the 1920s. Until women got the right to vote, it was not a crime to beat your wife because she was your property, right? Women, until the passing of the 19th Amendment, were considered property. And it wasn't a crime to damage your own property, right? So this became part of this like ex post facto laws. They passed a law that said you couldn't beat your wife, right? Historically, if you look back on this, there was a lawyer, an attorney, and he argued that you're not allowed to damage your own property. It wasn't that women had rights, right? The first laws about not beating your spouse wasn't about being good to women. It was about not damaging property, right? So what they did is they passed a law that said you couldn't beat your spouse. But because of what an ex post facto law does, what would normally happen, right? You're like, this is a law, right? They've broken that law in the past, right? So they're going to be convicted. And that's called an ex post facto law, right? I say that it's illegal after the fact, right? I decide that it's illegal after the fact, and then we prosecute this. And sometimes we talk about what's called a grandfather clause. What the United States decided when we're talking about other crimes, right? The drug use was much more common in the 1960s. So when they criminalized drug use, right, you couldn't prosecute all those people who were doing drugs publicly when it was legal. You couldn't prosecute all those people who were abusing their spouses when it was considered legal because they were property, right? So all of these factors come in together that you can't pass a law and then punish people who had committed that crime before the passing of that law. And these are all based on things that the Crown did while the United States was colonized, right? So you had all of these things. Because of that, right, after you gain independence, right, and the Articles of Confederation don't work. Remember, we go independence, Articles of Confederation, then the Constitution and dual federalism, right? So eventually the United States and the people in charge decide we need a Bill of Rights. We need things that the government just absolutely cannot do. They need to be explicit that the government can't do those things, right? And they need to cover the things that matter to us. Those are the things that matter, right? That's why the Third Amendment is you can't quarter soldiers in people's houses. You can't force them, right? That's not relevant to us, right? It wouldn't really even come up. We have bases and things and infrastructure for that, but it was important to them at that time. You had some anti-federalists saying, well, don't write all of the rights down, because what happens when you write them all down, if it's not on that list, then it's not a right, right? That's one of the arguments the anti-federalists would make, that If you write this Bill of Rights and then it's not in there, then all of a sudden you don't have any right except those rights that are listed, right? And that's the difference between like express powers and implicit powers, right? You only have expressed liberties. There are no implied liberties at the founding. So in 1833, it was determined that the Bill of Rights only limits the national government. And we'll talk about this when we talk about Nevada, right? Or the Utah territory. The idea in the original Constitution was that the federal government could establish no religion. But when we would go to states, those states could set up a religion, right? Why does the Utah territory exist? Why does Brigham Young go out there to this place called Deseret, try to set up his own little area? Because he wants to create a part of the United States that is Mormon, right? Why is Utah so Mormon? Because it's established by a Mormon community. And because of the way the Constitution is written, right, the Mormon territory the Utah territory establishes the Mormon religion as the religion of that community. It discriminates against non-Mormons, right? And all of this is legal because it's the state doing it. And the Bill of Rights only applies to the federal government. The federal government is limited, the states are not, right? So in 1868, you have 3 amendments come out, right? It's right after the Civil War, and you have 3 amendments come out. And some of them are very clear, right? It's the end of slavery, right? It's the extension of, the 12th Amendment is the end of slavery. The 13th Amendment is the extension of voting rights to Black males, right? And then the 14th Amendment is the extension of federal Bill of Rights to the states. And we've talked about this already, so I won't get too much in this. But what matters, right, is this language about, right, you cannot abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, and no state, right, deprive any person of life, liberty, or property. So when you have this language, the argument then becomes, can you still have a religion in a state? Can you still discriminate in a state? Can you have segregation in a state? But in 1868, the 14th Amendment is not applied. Even though the amendment becomes ratified and it becomes part of the United States, right? The 12th, the 13th, the 14th, they become ratified, right? Because the Union the southern states have to ratify it in order to come back into the Union. So it gets ratified very quickly. You have all of these amendments, but how are they incorporated into the American system? And they do this through a very slow process called selective incorporation. The 14th Amendment is one of the very, very few amendments that goes through this process. Because what they have to do is they have to start deciding, is this a state right or is this an individual right, right? It adds a third layer. When you have the first founding, you have supremacy clause that gives it to the federal government, and you have the 10th Amendment that protects the state's rights. What then happens is because of the supremacy clause, now you have the federal government and what limits it has, you have the state government and what limits it has, and then you have the individual rights of people, right? People have individual rights that are guaranteed by the federal government. And it creates this 3-layer system that now you have to deal with, right? And because of that, it goes through a process. And the first part of this process is this right to property, right? In the 19th century, some people were not allowed to own property, right? Sometimes I think we'll talk about this later, but today we talk about redlining, that there are districts, right? There are districts that minorities couldn't move into, right? That you couldn't buy a home in certain areas. But before that, there were these clauses in a sale. And what used to happen, what was then eventually deemed unconstitutional, is I would have a home and I would sell you my home, right? I would sell you my home for the example, right? Right? I would sell that home to another white person, another white male. But in the sale of the home, I would make that white male signs a clause that he would never sell that home, and no one who ever bought that home in the future would ever sell it to a minority, usually specifically a Black person, right? That's a clause that I would put in the sale. You're not allowed to sell it to a minority. And that would keep that community from legally being allowed to sell those homes to minorities, and it would keep that segregation going, right? So the 14th Amendment starts going through this process, and it takes a long time because you're like, okay, but can individuals enter an agreement in which they say they're not going to sell to certain people? Is that an individual liberty? Is that something that the government can't interfere in? Or is it that the states can't do that because they're limited in the same way? They can't enforce that because they're limited in the same way that the federal government. Now that we're tying the Bill of Rights to include that states can't violate them, what does that mean? And because it's such a complicated process, it takes a long time. That's why you don't have anything from 1897 to 1925. And it's not until 1925 that all Americans have a right to free speech, right? You could be arrested for your public statements until 1925. And we'll talk about like fighting words and libel and things like that later, right? But it's 1925 that you really first get freedom of speech in the states. Before that, it was only in the federal government that you had freedom of speech. By 1931, then it becomes this question of, can the press produce anything that they want, right? Can they be restricted? What are they allowed to do, right? And the freedom of the press becomes in 1931. It's not a coincidence that the freedom of the press comes in 1931 and the Great Depression starts in 1929, right? There was a clear evidence that the press was not being informed about what was happening in government policy or what was about to happen, or the understanding of speculation or the laws that had been changed, right? And so in the New Deal, when we have the New Deal and FDR comes in and the Democrats come in 32, right? After 29 and going to 32, this shift comes where the courts and the people start saying, we have to be more informed, right? And then over time, right, we know in the 1970s, we have the Freedom of Information Act. And this is a continuance of the 14th Amendment, right? You have a right to access information, to public speech, and then finally in 1939 to assembly, right? This is where you start having unions, right? The history of unions is quite short in the United States, right? But in 1939, then people want to get together and have farmers unions, right? And it's declared that you have a right to assembly, to gather. This is part of the reason why, right, the no mask sort of protesters, what they're really talking about. You can't tell me not to gather in groups, right? We have a right to assembly in our Constitution. The government can't restrict our right to assembly. It's very problematic for us because we have to institute safety mandates to space this out. But, right, if a student were to show up, they have a right to be in this classroom, right? They paid, the assembly allows for them to come in. We're trying to manage those two things. So the 14th Amendment goes through a very slow process of selective incorporation, in which we take pieces of it and incorporate it. And then it speeds up in the 1960s. So now let's talk specifically about the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment. Okay. So the First Amendment has two major parts, right? The first is the Establishment Clause. And the Establishment Clause is a little different because of the way the language works. Free speech is easier, right? I shouldn't censor your speech unless your speech leads to harming others, right? That's very simple, right? Freedom of speech is much more simple process. The Establishment Clause in the First Amendment is more difficult because it says no law respecting an establishment of religion, right? I cannot establish a religion. I can't produce laws that recognize a religion in the federal government. We have a lot of violations of that in states, but right, you can't do that. And so eventually the Supreme Court comes out with what's called a Lemon test. And a Lemon test creates this issue. If you're going to school, right, say, right, most of you remember high school, right? If you're in high school and you and your group of friends are going to sit down at a table and pray before you eat, or what you see a lot is you have sports teams, right? Before they go out to a game, they'll pray, right? It was really problematic because I can't establish, right? As a coach, I can't establish religion, but if that person's a government employee, but people want to pray and you can't restrict them from praying either. So you have this issue about people have a right now under the 14th Amendment that they have freedom of religion, but the government can't interfere, it can't recognize. So how do you figure this out? And so the Lemon test goes through three different steps. The first is, did it have a secular purpose? Now, what they decided with sports is that is part of the preparation of the sports game, right? Crowding up in a circle and praying or having those words, that's actually a purposeful activity that has a secular point, right? That's all of you getting to the right mindset to engage in that activity, right? Whether right or wrong, right? That is the secular purpose, right? If you are a women's health clinic, but you're also deeply religious, but you provide women's health services, even if you're a pro-life clinic and you're always telling them to have the child, if you also provide like vitamins, prenatals, and exams, right? Then you have a secular purpose. It fulfills a secular purpose, right? So you pass that part of the Levin test. The next part is it neither advances or inhibits a religion. This is very, very difficult, right? My language right now inhibits a religion, right? I just talked about even if you're pro-life, right? That language in and of itself shows an internal bias, right? And because of that, right, I might be expressing something as a government employee where I'm not as well aligned with Christianity as someone else in this room, right? So you have to find this very, very careful balance. And if you're an organization like a school, right, I can't lead prayer, but I've had a lot of students pray, especially when I teach harder courses, right? If I had an in-class exam, I have seen a lot of students pray before an exam, right? That's a very normal process for someone who feels stressed, right? If they're religious, to go through that process, right? I would never tell them not to do that, right? You have to find that balance, right? And in the legal system, you have to make sure that you're not harming or advancing anyone in that process, right? And this is usually where most people sort of know whether it's true or not, right? It becomes very clear at this point whether or not you're advancing or inhibiting, right? At one point, some schools said you can't pray. That's inhibiting, right? At another point, it was that teachers could lead prayer, right? That's advancing. It's very clearly advancing because you have an authority figure leading that religion, right? As also an employee of that organization. So sometimes it's clear, but it becomes very complicated, and that's the test. The last part is that it doesn't entangle government and religious institutions. And this is very hard to know, right? If you get to this test, this is when the Supreme Court has to get involved because they really need to think about this and analyze this. There are courthouses that have the Ten Commandments in front of their courthouse, right? Does that entangle the government with a religion, right? Does it entangle that organization, that state court with that religion, right? Does it create requirements for that courthouse to behave in a certain way, right? Coveting and stealing and murder, those are still secular crimes. So how do we differentiate between those two, right? Now that's the most obvious example, right? And you might think, okay, it does entangle, but a Christian would say no, and guess what? The Supreme Court said no, right? A state court can have the Ten Commandments outside because it's just a piece of art in front of it. It serves a secular purpose, right? People like seeing the Ten Commandments, right? Whether it's a religious art or just art in general, they like seeing that out there, right? It doesn't enhance or inhibit, right? Because you're allowed to see it, but you don't actually enforce those things in the courthouse. And it doesn't entangle because the judges don't have to follow those Ten Commandments. Even if they do and they believe, but they believed in it before, right? It's an expression, not an enforcement, right? So the Supreme Court says, no, you can have the Ten Commandments in front of a courthouse. If you're not religious, right, or if that doesn't feel appropriate, right, it went through this process of determining whether or not it violated the First Amendment. And that's what we have to consider, right? Did it violate the First Amendment? Not is it right or wrong, did it violate this? And eventually the Supreme Court says it does not violate the First Amendment because it passes the Levin test. The other part that we talk about is this free exercise clause. You are allowed to practice whatever religion, right? There are a lot of religious practices in the United States that are very difficult to allow, right? There's snake, I don't want to say snake charming because that has its own connotation, right? But there are Christians who hold snakes when they pray. There are religions that carry around a knife, right? The males in that society always have a knife on them, and they have to have it on them all the time when they go to school, right? When they go on bed, right? They just always have to have this knife on them. And so if you're a public school, you can't force them to not carry that knife, right? We had a very big problem a few years ago, right? Obviously, it's not an issue now because of how things change, right? About women wearing headgear, right? Or headscarves or whatever they were going to wear, right? Can they? No, they have a freedom, right? The court was never unclear about this. Even though society made like it's not okay, right? The reason why you would never ask them to take it off is because of this free exercise clause, right? The government cannot tell you what to believe, and it can't stop you from practicing your belief to an extent, right? Christian scientists don't believe in modern medicine, so are you doing harm to that child? And that child is not you, right? So that child has a right, right? Some people believe that children don't have rights until they're 18. That's simply not true, right? Your rights are given at birth, right? Once you're born or naturalized into an American, you have all of your rights. So Christian Scientists deal with this a lot more, where they're forced to take their children to a doctor because that's not part of the free exercise clause. The next part in the First Amendment is the freedom of speech. Now, freedom of speech it has a couple of parts, but originally it was that people could speak out in the way that they felt comfortable. But we know historically, right, that you could be arrested for swearing in front of a woman. You could be arrested for using inappropriate language in general. So we have to split this out a little bit. The first is called political speech. Political speech is not normal speech. What we have every day conversationally is normal speech. Political speech includes calls to action. And calls to action are problematic because when I call to action, what if my call to action is to burn something down? What if my call to action is to get out there and stop people, right? This happened, not that I'm gonna pick on Trump, like in the last few presidencies, why would I reference them more? It's because we have so much video, right? But during a Trump campaign rally before he was elected, right, he said rough those people up. Protests, he told them to rough people up, right? Protesters were there. That was not determined that it violated him because he wasn't clear about it or whatever was determined. But when you're a political candidate and you're talking about behavior, you have to worry about what are called fighting words. And fighting words is where you directly incite damage, right? You say, we need to burn that courthouse, right? Shay's rebellion, right? He's like, we need to burn this courthouse down. We need to go and harass these judges. We need to go and get physical with these groups to stop what's happening, right? Now, they were trying to save their farms and whatever, right? The ethics is not about it. It's that your language directly incited a violent act that led to the damaging of property or people, right? Fighting words stops being protected by free speech as soon as another individual does what you told them to do and attacks someone or creates property damage, right? That's fighting words. Sometimes we talk about inciting a riot, but that's a little bit of an older issue, but it's also only state law, right? You can't get inciting a riot in the federal government. You can get cited for fighting words, right? That is an individual or a political candidate. There isn't a lot of other restrictions, right? You can't technically you would get punished for sort of inciting people, but there's not actually a law that says you can't yell fire in a private theater. There's sort of like a cultural practice, but most places don't have a specific law because theaters aren't the same way that they used to be, right? A crowded theater used to be like you would get trampled because the theaters are sort of amphitheaters now where they're open seating. That's not an actual law, but the idea is that you can't do that and then lead to damage. There aren't that many other restrictions. If you are an industry or you're some sort of company or corporation, then there are a lot more limits because corporate speech is very different than personal speech, right? Now, this is problematic, right? Because we just had a court case, right? That right, money is speech and that corporations can be treated as people, right? Maybe 10 years ago now. Right? You have all these cases, Citizens United case, right? That corporations should be treated as people, and therefore they have the First Amendment right, and they have money, therefore money is speech, and it's free speech, so they can spend unlimited money, right? The Supreme Court decides this because it fits with the laws that exist, right? Even if we disagree with the outcome, it fits with the laws that exist in a judicial sense. What you can't do as a corporation is have misleading claims, right? This actually comes about more clearly in the 80s and 90s against smoking, right? Before smoking became this sort of like despicable behavior, right? It's going to kill you. There used to be a lot of people who would make arguments that they felt better when they were smoking, right? Doctors would recommend cigarettes, right? You'd have these advertisements that would say not a cough in the car, and they'd all be smoking, right? That you had this shift. And one of the reasons why corporate speech is so much more likely to be led to court is because there are so many misleading claims in the products, right? Think about even before cigarette salesmen, right? Snake oil salesmen or soap salesmen. Soap salesmen used to put drugs and lead in their stuff to make it heavier, and because people thought that heavier soaps were more effective, right? So you have all this corporate speech, and so the laws around corporate speech are very, very different. You can't have misleading claims. You can't have false claims, right? And you have to prove that your claims are not false. You can't say that your drug cures a disease unless it actually cures a disease, right? And the burden of proof is on the company, not on the government to prove. And we'll talk about this when we do libel and slander. We also know that in commercials, right, and in corporate speech, right, the US has a lot of other aspects, right? Some of you don't, it's been around so long. Can you drink alcohol in a commercial in America? No, right? You can't drink the alcohol that they're selling. You can't actually pick up the drink and put it to your mouth if you're selling that product. But we see drinking in shows, right? And that may or may not be alcohol. So when you have, right, someone who is pretending or drinking alcohol, that's fine. You can show an individual drinking, but you can't sell a product and the salesman drink the alcohol, right? So commercial speech is treated very, very differently. And that'll come up later in the semester. The other part that is concerning today, or that we talk about a lot today, is what's called speech plus. And actually, college students are more likely to do this than anyone else. This is where you go out into, right, our free speech area, which is by the library, right, that sort of path, that crossroads in the concrete, right? You go out there and you speak out about something, and then you sit there and you take up space, right? One of the arguments that came about in the civil rights area was that you had a right to speak your mind and to be in that space and take up space while you were doing it. And this created this idea that you could have a sit-in and you could speak publicly against some policy, and that's protected by free speech. Even though it's your physical body doing it, that is part of speech plus, and it's protected under the First Amendment. I don't know if we're behind yet. I'm just going to keep going. We have a little bit more, but I want to get through it and have a few minutes after to answer any questions. If you have any questions now, okay. I don't know how many people. I wish I knew more about this. Okay. So now, right, the third part of the First Amendment, it was so important that these things were linked together, but also they're the First Amendment, right? So you have to be able to practice whatever religion you want. You have to be able to say you want, but that also means that the press has to have access to things, right? So remember, this is a response to colonial rule. You can't tell me I have to be part of the Church of England, right, which is a little bit different from Protestantism or Catholicism, right? You can't make me be part of the Church of England. You can't make me be a Christian either, right? Even though, right, clear discrimination against non-Christians even today, right? I can speak my mind, and you can't just arrest me. You can't force me not to speak my mind unless I'm telling people to do harm. And then the press comes out and they have to create some sort of system. And what used to happen is if you ever said something the government didn't like, they would say, you did something wrong. So now we can censor you before. We don't have to check if what you're coming out with is wrong. We're just going to censor you because you've done something wrong. So prior restraint is the government agency says, well, you in the past have done something wrong, so we're not going to allow you to speak out anymore until it's been filtered through, right? We actually see prior restraint being reinstituted in things like Twitter and Facebook, right, and other social media platforms that I have no idea what they are, right? But what you see is you have some individuals being taken off Twitter. Now that's prior restraint. In the past, you have said something that was inappropriate. I'm not going to allow you to continue. Technically, that violates their First Amendment right. If they were out speaking publicly and it was the government doing it, it would be against the right. Remember, civil liberties are limits on government. Twitter is a company, right? They're private. So they can say you can't use our service anymore. That right? And the government has no ability to interfere in that, right? Unless there's discrimination, right? Civil liberties limit the government, but I can discriminate against you, right? If you ask me a question that I don't like in week 2, and then in week 15 you raise your hand, I can just ignore you because I don't want to deal with you, right? That's me behaving that way, not an institution behaving that way. It's probably a bad example because I represent the institution. But, right, Twitter can block anyone they want. They can decide who to block. Now, there might be economic costs, but the government doesn't get to come in and say, all right, you're not allowed to do that. The government also can't go to a newspaper and say, you've printed bad stories in the past, we're going to do this. Why does the National Enquirer, I don't know if that's one of those, we'll talk about the printing press later, but the National Enquirer used to be a magazine where like they would talk about like Bad Boy or something like that. Very clearly not well-checked sources. But because of this prior restraint issue, the government can't use prior restraint. So they have to look at every single article that the National Guard puts out and test if that was malicious intent to tell a falsehood, right? They have to check it again and again and again. They can't say, you've been lying this whole time, you're not going to be allowed to print it, right? So the press has a lot of freedom. There are only 2 times that the press can be punished for a story that they put out or a statement that they use. And it is when they have reckless disregard of the truth. Now, this is very, very problematic because you can be wrong, right? Reporters are also wrong. Retractions are actually quite common, right? I reported something because of the information I had at the time, and then I got more information and that information changed, right? Right now, you have a lot of reporters who are sort of splitting on this French, right? These American soldiers who were buried in France, right? In a mausoleum in France, right? Did the president say they were losers and suffers, right? We don't have audio right now. We don't have clear. We have some people saying he said it and some people saying he didn't say it. And so the press is reporting. Some of them are reporting he said it, and some of them are reporting that's nonsense, right? As we get more information, right? Some of those people will be wrong, right? If you have 2 opposing views, at some point, some of them will just naturally be wrong. So because of that, right, someone's going to have to print a retraction. That is not reckless disregard of the truth, right? You can be wrong. And this is why libel and slander are so problematic. Did you intentionally, maliciously disregard the truth? Did you go to a point where you said, I know the truth, and instead I'm going to say something that I know is false because I want to damage his character, right? This is what's problematic, because how do you prove that someone knew something, right? Because people can always say, even if they had it, right? Even if they had a document that was different from their opinion when they wrote the story, did they remember that document? Did they read that document? Did they understand that document? So proving libel and slander is very difficult. Now, why am I combining them so much? The only difference in the law between libel and slander that matters to you is that libel is written and slander is spoken, right? Slander is oral. If I were to say something that was clearly slanderous, it would be because I was disregarding the truth. I knew that wasn't true, right? If I say, right, I'm going to use a term, this is hyperbole. This is not something I believe, right? But if I say, like, Obama's a lizard person, and I know he's not a lizard person, and I have all the information, that will be slander, right? I'm trying to damage him with something that I know is nonsense. Now, whether or not believe in, like, lizard people, whatever, that's not the point. I don't, right? Everything about me knows that that's not a thing, right? I have the information. That would be malicious and reckless disregard for the truth, that I know I'm saying something that is false, and I know I'm doing it to sound. Obviously, that's sort of an extreme because it's nonsensical, right? Unless you believe lizard people, and that's your proof, right? That's fine for you to have it. It's not capable for me to have, so for me, it would be slander. But how would you prove it, right? How do you prove those aspects? And then libel is written. Now, the thing about libel is that it's easier to prove libel because it's written. One of these things is called a benefit of review. Everything that you write is of higher quality than the things that you say, right? Whenever I'm speaking to you, it should be of lower quality than the things that I write to you. Because when I write you an announcement, or if I write something to you, I write it and then I read it. And then I say, okay, this is something that I feel comfortable with. But when I'm talking to you, there's no saying, oh, I said it, now I have to go back. There's no review, right? So slander is incredibly hard to prove because we sometimes misspeak, sometimes it's not clear. Libel's a little easier because you said you wrote this, it went through your publisher, it went through whoever it went through, right? It went through editors and they still put it through. So someone should have caught this, right? So libel's a little easier, slander's a little harder. And because politicians speak so much, they can make this argument, well, I spoke for 4 hours that day. Of course I was going to say something that was a little off. So slander is very difficult. Okay. Got a little while to go, but let's just keep going. All right. So now we're past the First Amendment. Now we're going to talk about the rights of the criminally accused. Because, right, remember, the First Amendment, right, that's about what can you believe? What can you say? What can you, right? Does the press have access to the government? What can they say, right? How do we make sure that we're getting the most information out to the people without intentionally, right, misleading individuals, right? That's the thing about free speech. I want you to be able to say whatever you want, but you can't intentionally mislead someone else, right? Because then that violates their rights, right? Or that infringes on their ability to pursue life, liberty, and happiness, right? Or have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the next part is, well, what happens when someone breaks the law? right? Or how do we determine if someone breaks the law? And this creates this part in two parts, right? Second Amendment is gun ownership. Third Amendment is whether or not you can have individuals, where the government can force soldiers to live in your home, quarter troops in your home, right? So then we go to the Fourth Amendment, and this is a legal search and seizure, right? The Fourth Amendment is about legal search and seizure. And it creates this due process of law. And so first, every individual, you can't just have the government behave arbitrarily. What do I mean by arbitrarily? I can't just pick one of you out and decide that you're going to jail randomly, or just pick you out. It cannot be because I see you and I think you're doing something wrong. There has to be a reason for it. Now, there are two different systems to determine whether or not you're something wrong, right? In civil court, it's different from criminal court. Criminal court is this beyond a reasonable doubt. And beyond a reasonable doubt is any reasonable person wouldn't have doubts. It's not that there are no doubts, right? People always have doubts, right? You're never entirely 100% sure in a criminal case. But beyond a reasonable doubt means I have to prove to you, the jury, right, that there is no reasonable doubt at all. If there is one reasonable doubt, that man is not guilty, or that individual is not guilty, right? There's one reasonable doubt, right? It doesn't matter if it's just one person have one reasonable doubt, that person is innocent. And this is such a rejection of how colonial rule was that it becomes this burden. In a criminal court, one person's reasonable doubt means that person is free. And what does a reasonable doubt mean? It's kind of shift, right? But it can't just be a doubt, it has to be somewhat of a reasonable doubt, right? If someone says he drove from UNLV to Henderson in 12 minutes, right, to Fiesta in 12 minutes, you'd be like, I have a reasonable doubt. The idea that you would drive that far in 12 minutes. Or, right, that they found a parking spot in the middle of the day in front of the student union and then were able to get in and out of UNLV without being caught on camera in 8 minutes, right? You're like, that's problematic. I don't know about that, right? There should be some record, or it'd be difficult to the process, right? You'd have some reasonable doubt. In a civil court, it's not like that, right? It's very different. In a civil court, all they need is a preponderance of evidence, right? That the evidence for is greater than the evidence against. Why is civil court easier? Because in civil court, you cannot go to jail. You cannot go to jail in the civil court, right? So we have to have the threshold higher in a criminal court because you could be sentenced to death, you can be put in prison for the rest of your life, right? All of these things can happen to you, right? So a fine, right, even though we will talk about, right, this idea of debt prisons and things like that later, right? Do I just give you a fine and you can't pay it and you end up in jail anyways, right? That's a problem for later in the semester. But for now, right, criminal courts, because you can go to jail and because you can sentence to death, the standard has to be higher, right? And I'm going to use a historical case, right? It doesn't matter how you feel about this way, but right, O.J. Simpson, not guilty in criminal court, right? Not guilty in criminal court. Found not guilty because he used different language, but found that he had to pay damages to the families in civil court, right? The preponderance of evidence was there, right? But there was not proof beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed those crimes, right? Why do you have two different outcomes? Because the standards are different, right? So that's part of our due process, right? So we have criminal and civil. There has to be a due process, but there also has to be, right, a reason for me to start looking at you in the first place. And the Fourth Amendment actually doesn't protect you from illegal search and seizure, right? If a cop comes in, if a cop like kicks your door down and then comes in and you're living in California and you're 19 and you have a pack of cigarettes, he's like, I found this pack of cigarettes, I'm going to punish you. You can't stop that, right? That's the thing about civil liberties. They don't actually stop enforcement agents. It's after the fact that we see if there's a violation of civil liberties. And when you violate the Fourth Amendment, right? The Fourth Amendment is that you have to have a reason to search and seize property, right? The Fourth Amendment comes in the courts. Why do police officers not just kick drug dealers' door down to just collect the evidence and do this? Because of this exclusionary rule. If there isn't a warrant, if there isn't some sort of court order for me to search, if there isn't some reasonable cause for me to collect this evidence, when I get to a court, then they will use the exclusionary rule and they have to, the jury has to not know about it, right? You can't even discuss that evidence to the jury, right? The jury has to be absent from that evidence. And if all the evidence you collected violated the Fourth Amendment, then you don't have evidence for that case. So police officers, when they do show restraint in this issue, is because they want the evidence to go to court. So they have to make sure that they don't violate your Fourth Amendment rights, or else it won't hold up in court, right? Okay. The Fifth Amendment is this about non-self-incrimination. And in the federal government, it creates a couple of things. The first is a grand jury. Grand juries exist in the federal government, in New York, and a couple other places. Before you ever go to court in New York or the federal government, the attorney, whoever's in charge of the prosecution, brings in 9 people or some other number of people, but in New York, in some places it's not. I don't know if it's changed in New York recently. They do not decide guilt or innocence. And there's no defense. It is just the prosecution and this grand jury. And the prosecution's job is to convince the grand jury that there's even a case to begin with, right? The grand jury is a step so that you don't just arrest someone and then you start worrying about whether or not you can find them guilty. First, in the federal government, you have to prove to a grand jury that that person there is even a case against that person. That's why the federal government actually does much better than state governments in prosecution, because before they ever arrest someone, they have to take it to their peer group, to 9 people, not government employees, but a jury of 9 people who are considered the peers to that individual, and convince them beyond a reasonable doubt, if it's a criminal case, right, that they have a case. Now, the defense isn't there, right, because they don't want to give away their case, but also the defense doesn't need to be there because there is no case yet to defend, right? So an attorney really tries to get this. And this is part of the Fifth Amendment, because due process isn't just you've been arrested, you have to have a court case in the next couple of weeks, you have to have a hearing in the next weeks to actually determine this. Before all of that, in the federal government, there has to be some argument in a grand jury that they believe there was a crime committed for there ever to be a court case at all, right? For all of that to happen. The other part about this is that there has to be proof that you're not being convicted twice for the same crime, right? It used to be, because in the United States, if you go away for murder, it's like 20 to life. In most places in the world, if you go for murder, it's 8 to 12 years. So what would happen, right, even under colonial rule, is I would arrest you and I would put you in jail for a year. And then you would get out of jail and I would arrest you for that same crime and I'd put you in jail for a year, right? And that would allow you to be convicted of the same crime over and over. So the Fifth Amendment includes this idea of double jeopardy. You can't be convicted for the same crime twice, right? You can't be convicted for the same crime twice. Then the part that we all know, self-incrimination, right? You can plead the Fifth at any time you're in front of a courthouse and you believe the answer to the question would put you in sort of legal violation. You can say, I plead the Fifth. This is the self-incrimination part of the Fifth Amendment, right? You don't have to say that you did something wrong, ever, even under oath, right? You can't lie under oath. That's perjury. But if someone asks you, like, did you murder that person, you can plead the Fifth. Now, in American society, if you plead the Fifth when you're asked that question correctly, right, you're going to go to jail, because now, right, in our society, we think, oh, they pled the Fifth, they must have done it, right? But you have a right to plead the Fifth, right? It's just juries, they're not impartial, right? We shouldn't assume that. If you were a part of a jury, you wouldn't be impartial, right? If you are a female juror and the person in front of you beat his wife or is accused of beating his wife, right? He allegedly beat his wife, you're more likely to convict that person. We know that, right? You're like, you're probably not even that concerned. You're like, he might have done it, so he should be in jail, right? The impartiality, and I'm not picking on, right? Obviously, we know, right, that minorities are much less likely to convict. Why are they much less likely to convict? Because they believe people are innocent and being put in jail despite being innocent, right? So when you have those biases internalized, right, you have trouble with that, right? For those of you, Dave Chappelle's probably maybe well before your time, but right, it's almost impossible for him to be convinced that someone's guilty in America. Why? Because he has seen so many people be treated as guilty when they were innocent, right? So those biases exist. It's not always impossible, but you have a right to say that you have Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination. The next part is this idea of the Miranda rule. So you have to be told your rights before you are arrested, right? We talk about Miranda rights, but the Miranda rule is part of this that was established And it was much later in a court case that this was clearly established, but the Fifth Amendment gives you a right to know that you don't have to behave a certain way, right? What eventually became the Miranda rights come from the Fifth Amendment, right? You should know the rights that you have. You should know that you have a right to have a competent defense, right? That if you don't have an attorney, one right can be provided for you. And why do they say you can remain silent? Because that's part of your Fifth Amendment. You don't always have to say, I plead the Fifth, right? You can just be silent, right? And that right comes from the Fifth Amendment, to just say nothing to the police, right? Now, obviously, we're in a very different environment this year, right? How do you respond to the police, right? How do you deal with that interaction, right? But you've always had a right not to talk to the police, right? And police brutality has always been an issue. But every time police brutality is a response to silence, it's a clear violation of your Fifth Amendment rights, right? Violates those civil liberties. The last part is eminent domain, right? The government can take your house, anyone's house. But in the United States, they have to pay you for it, right? That's the difference, right? The government can always take your property. In all countries, the government can take your property. It is expected, right? When we talk about civil forfeiture, which is this big headache where they can take your property and then accuse your property of a crime. But in eminent domain, if I take something from you, your car, your land, your business, I have to reimburse you. Why is it that after World War II in the Japanese internment camps, many Japanese were reimbursed? Because of this eminent domain. I took something from you, I have to give you fair compensation for it. Now, it may not feel fair if you lived in your house for 20 years and it's only worth, 200 grand, which whatever houses are worth, and I give you the value of the home, even though you spent all that time building it up and making it nice, right? It may not feel fair, but at least there's some protection, right? Remember that under colonial rule, I could just say your house is now a barracks, that soldiers live there and you don't, right? So a lot of this is a response to governments taking things without a response. And eminent domain is a way for me to say, I still need highways, right? We just had a big reconstruction on 95. I have to be able to build that highway, and I have to build it through homes, because there's no other way to build a highway into Las Vegas without damaging some homes. So I'm going to buy your house. You are going to have to move, but I'm trying to balance the needs of the community versus your property ownership, right? So eminent domain is a response to that. Right. The Sixth Amendment is a speedy and public trial and impartial jury, right? We talked about this. Are you ever truly impartial? As impartial as possible, right? As impartial as you can possibly be, right? Impartiality is always the goal, even if it's not achieved. You confront your witness and assistance of counsel, right? The Sixth Amendment is why you can have, why you're giving a public defender. It's why you can't just not have a trial for months at a time, right? It's why our bail system, even though our bail system has some issues, why do you have to be allowed bail, right? We'll talk about this when we get to the Eighth Amendment, right? Because you have to be able to have a trial quickly. You can't just sit in jail and say, oh, we'll get to a trial eventually. The confront witnesses part deals directly with you need to know why you're going through that, right? Now, today it's problematic, right? I think some of the things that, because of the Sixth Amendment, you were some things. If you attack a child and that child is a witness, why do we have like TVs in courtrooms now, right? One of the reasons was if you were the perpetrator, if you had hurt a child, right, you had to hear that child's voice so you could confront that witness, right? Your attorney had to ask that individual questions to defend you. That's that confrontation of witnesses, right? So as we shift a little, it sort of changed, right? But the idea is that it can't just be some anonymous person, right? Why do we have this that you can confront your witnesses? Because the courts would say, under colonial rule in the beginning of the American government, they would say, oh, someone told me this, so you're going to go to jail. No, who told you? Who's the witness? What did the witness actually say, right? It's confrontation of witnesses. So the rights of the accused, right? Think about it. The rights of the accused, the first three amendments are about the military and about speech, but 4, 5, and 6, right, and 8 create this, how do we treat people when they have broken the law? Or how do we treat people when we think they have broken the law, right? It is so important to us in the United States, the rights of the accused, that this becomes a huge part of our Bill of Rights. You can't just arrest me, you can't just take my property. The Eighth Amendment creates two things: no excessive bail or fines, and then no cruel or unusual punishment. Cruel and unusual punishment, because it is worded sort of poorly, has no meaning in all meaning, right? In the last 10 years, Texas and California have had prison reform because in California, the Supreme Court, the federal Supreme Court, decided that California's prison system was unconstitutional. They had too many people sleeping in a single cell. They'd have a single cell and have 2 to 3 people sleeping in that room. They had prison overcrowding, and because of that, they couldn't provide medical services to those prisoners, right? This was deemed cruel and unusual punishment. It was deemed that it violated the 8th Amendment, and therefore the Supreme Court demanded that prison reform occur in California, right? Because California was hit, right, Texas said, we know that that's the precedent. The court decided that that violates the 8th Amendment, therefore our prison system has to be reformed. And so before the Supreme Court ever got involved with the Texas prison system, they changed their system. So the 8th Amendment, including those punishment, is determined case by case a lot of times, but it provides this where you might think that these are prisoners. Why is it that they have to be provided medical care? Why is it that, right, when we don't have universal insurance, how can it violate the 8th Amendment, but they're not? But the courts decide this, right, they're being detained, and in the specific case in California, the individuals were mentally ill, and there wasn't enough resources to provide them with counseling or medication, right? And because we, in the 80s, we closed down in the 80s, all our mental health facilities, like public mental, they were shut down. So now all the mental health, people who have mental health issues who are threats to themselves or other, they end up in prison. But that means the prisons are now responsible for providing that. And because the 8th Amendment, the courts have said, if someone's mentally ill and that's why you're detaining them, you have to provide them with services, right? Prison overcrowding to create that 8th Amendment problem. So cruel and unusual punishment could mean that, right? Why do we not have a firing range anymore, right? Why do we not execute people with lethal injection or the gas chamber anymore, or the electric chair anymore, right? Because this is that cruel and unusual, right? Sheriff Joe Arpaio, I want to say, in Arizona, he makes his inmates be outside in the heat and wear pink, right? Right in this prison. Is that cruel and unusual punishment, right? Is it cruel and is it unusual? Remember, it has to be some evidence of both, right? Unusual in and of itself is just unusual, but is it off in some way? The fact that he had them out in the heat was a concern, right? But it was made clear they provided enough water. The fact that they wore pink was unusual, but the idea that making men wear pink is cruel is problematic, right? We can't determine that forcing people to wear color is cruel, right? So that was determined not to be a violation of those amendments. What ended up being is they didn't have good sanitation in those camps where he had put them out there in the heat, right? Sanitation became the necessary violation, right? So when you're talking about the 8th Amendment, that's cruel and unusual punishment and bails, it's about making sure that people aren't going through unnecessary hardship that is there because some individual sort of arbitrarily wants it to be there, right? And it doesn't violate their other rights. Okay. So you have the 10 amendments, right? That we were not going to talk about the 7th and the 9th. It just it's not. I don't expect you to memorize all the amendments. I expect you to know the ones we're talking about, right? That I pull the exam questions from the slides. So I want you to know these things, but I want you to understand the amendments. Why are they there? What do they actually do? What happens is in the 20th century, you introduce this idea of the right to privacy. There is no constitutional amendment that gives you a right to privacy. What the courts decide is that you have this right to be left alone. And it comes from the 3rd, the 4th, and the 5th Amendment. You can't put military personnel, right? The 3rd Amendment says no quartering of troops. But what that extends to is I can't put government personnel, I can't make you allow government personnel to live in your home. You have a right to you have a protection against legal search and seizure, right? I can't just come in your home and look for things. And you have a right to non-self-incrimination, right? What you do in your home, I can't force you to tell me. I can't go into your home without cause, and I can't put government people in your home, right? And eventually, over time, quartering troops is also connected to like spying or wires, right? I can't listen in or put devices in your home to listen in without cause, right? So this creates a right to privacy, right? The right to privacy comes as a combination of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Amendments. What happens is then what is private, right? This creates a very different change, right? You see in the 20th century during the civil rights era, you see feminists arguing for the private to be public. Why are they saying that the private should be public? Because the government says if you beat your wife in your house, right, or if you rape your wife in your house, that's in your private sphere. And the government doesn't belong in your private sphere. Now, at the same time, right, when we talk about the Griswold case about birth control, taking medication is intensely private, right? The HIPAA laws that we have to protect patients is massive, right? We go through a lot to make sure that patients have a right to privacy. Because they have such a right to privacy, right, the Supreme Court decides that your right to privacy allows you to take pills regardless, as long as those pills are legal in the United States, you can't have restrictions on those individual uses, right? There used to be a drug called Quaaludes, which isn't produced anymore. It was legal for you to take it because you couldn't ask someone what that pill you're taking, right? At that time, now you can, right? But when it comes to birth control, it's eventually determined that is a private decision, that you have a right to privacy about the medication you're making, and that you have a right to decide about what interactions you have with your body, right? And this becomes the beginning of sort of the feminist movement for birth control, right? And sort of reproductive rights, right? So reproductive rights starts in this right to privacy. So the Griswold case is about birth control, and then you have the sort of famous, very, very well-known Roe v. Wade case. And we talked about this already, right? Is Roe v. Wade even the current case? No, but it's the case we like to talk about because it's sort of a landmark case. And the Supreme Court says that it's banning abortion creates this undue burden, that you are making a private decision about you, and now you have to engage in the government in a way that is inappropriate, that violates your privacy. Because there is no way, right? There is no way to a certain point for the government to know whether or not you are pregnant without violating your privacy, right? Without violating your privacy, there is absolutely no way for the government to know whether or not you're pregnant. And because it's a violation of your privacy to know whether or not you're pregnant, it is also a violation of privacy to know whether or not you got an abortion, right? If I'm not allowed to know whether or not if you're pregnant, make sure it doesn't pass how you can be pregnant or not pregnant, both doesn't matter. Then I'm also not allowed to involve in whether or not you stop being pregnant. Stop, start, that is not the business of the government because you have a right to privacy. So this becomes this landmark case because it reinforces the right to privacy so much that it changes a lot of other behavior, right? What is it about my own home that protects me, right? Whether it be an apartment or house, whatever. The things that you do in your home suddenly become legal, whatever it is, right? So you have the good cases, right? Or obviously that's biased, right? But you have these landmark cases that provide more protections, but you also have cases that allow people to continue in sort of illegal activity, right? Domestic abuse. Why is domestic abuse such a nightmare for law enforcement, right? Because you don't know what happened in that home, and you don't have a right to go into that home, right? You don't have a right to check on things. You don't have a right to monitor that home, right? So the right to privacy creates all of these opportunities for individuals to live lives without fear of government interference, but it also limits law enforcement, right? Remember that civil liberties are limits on government. They can't do things that they might consider good, and they can't do things that are considered infringement, right? That we know that we pay these costs when we have civil liberties. We know that limitations on government are there because we want to all have this opportunity to do that, and we accept, right, that there are other things that the government can't respond to, right? If someone didn't break the law, but we're worried about them, we can't force the police to be involved because they have a right to privacy. Over time, right, remember, and also, if we look back historically, we violate the Constitution constantly in our laws, right? It takes time for society to catch up and the laws to catch up to the Constitution, especially when you have a new amendment or when you develop this idea of a right to privacy. So then you start talking about sexual orientation. And this is when it comes into the government that they start deciding that this is a moral distinction. And while there might be police power in the morality, that the courts aren't a moral body. The courts are a legal body. They determine the constitutionality of the law, the precedents, the cases. And so sexual orientation in the courts start becoming some avenue, right? If you're an LGBT advocate or you're part of that community, right, the courts become the outlet. Because they're saying, no, I'm not going to enforce morality. What does the letter of the law say? And the letter of the law says that you have a right to privacy. So you cannot punish someone for doing something in their own home, even if you object to it morally, right? And so why is it that the courts have been such a bastion for, right, people who are a minority, whether it be racial or sexual? Because the courts never imply that social morality, right? They are always trying to figure out what is the legal aspect, right? And so the courts are a great avenue of approach for people who consider themselves to be oppressed. Obviously, right, we have the courts sort of deciding things over time, right? Same-sex marriage, Obergefell v. Hodges, right? Interracial marriage, Levy v. Virginia, right? There's all this advancement through the courts that you didn't see. And then, right, one of the more recent ones is called Gonzalez v. Oregon. And this is something that is very new, very modern. It's called right to die. The Supreme Court decided in Gonzalez v. Oregon that individuals who are dealing with a terminal disease where their condition and their quality of life would never improve had a right to die. And this is very unique to today because we are at a point in our medical sciences that you can have a terminal cancer that you will never recover from. Late stage cancer, because I've had family members, right, and my partner for 10 years had cancer, right, that survived, right, is fine. But right, you may not survive, right? At some point it becomes terminal, right? There's no way to cure stage 4 cancer. And apparently, right, I didn't live through it. I have to just speak from other people's experiences. Excruciatingly painful, right? Excruciatingly painful all the time, right? So now we're in a position where we can keep you alive, but we can't do a lot about the pain management, right? And you will never be okay. You will eventually die from this disease, but over time, right, we can keep you alive for a longer period of time. And so eventually the courts say, no, this is a privacy issue. If you are terminally ill and you cannot manage in a day-to-day life, right, it just will not function more, then you have a right to die. Now, remember, the right to privacy is that what you do in your home is fine. So why is this case something that I want to discuss and make sure we get into this? You can do it, right? You can end your own life, right? I mean, very clear, right? You're young, right? People going through a hard time, right? Suicide is not the answer, right? I'm talking about people who are much older, who are dealing with terminal disease. I don't want it to be unclear in this way, right? Everyone, if you need help, right, we have a CAP system, right? I don't want to get off of that, and right, because we have so many issues right now, I want to be very clear about that. What you can't do is have someone else injure, right? That will never be a thing because it's impossible to know the consent. It's impossible to check consent after the fact, right? This is not a morality argument, right? Remember, this is about legality in the Bill of Rights, right? I can't check with that other individual if they consented to that happening, right? Because there's no way to talk to them. There's no way to confront witnesses, right? Part of our constitutional Bill of Rights. You can't confront the witnesses, right? You can't make sure that there were no liberties violated, right? So this becomes a very new case, but it's very nuanced because we have to accept the medical reality that I can keep you alive, but your quality of life is going to be very low, and you're never going to get rid of the disease. But at the same time, expect that, okay, you still can't harm others because there's no way to check on the consent, right? You cannot have someone else help you. And for those of you who this topic is very new, there's so many cases where we're talking about this and so much new legal laws because it's so difficult to get through, right? Every single state in the United States has a law against suicide, right? Every single state. So you're committing a crime, but to know whether or not you committed that crime is a violation of your right of privacy, right? This is a great legal discussion that you can have, right? But what's important is that it's a modern day issue, right? Most of these are founding issues or they're civil rights issues. This is a today issue, right? I'm never going to recover. So I think those are the things that we have to discuss, right? And then again, I know I've repeated this, but I have an online audience and I have a personal audience, right? If you have any of those thoughts, right, about suicide, depression, right, there are avenues of approach. There's CAPS on campus, right? Almost every student in the campus has access to the medical center. It must be open, right? It's required to be open. So if you need something like that, and I know some of you will be watching this live stream later through a recording, so just have that there. But this is not to the end on. So that is all the lecture for today. I'm not going to leave the live stream just yet. This is the 5th edition for the Sage for State. I don't think there are any questions on the assignment. Assignment 2 is due on Thursday, so make sure that you do assignment 2. For those of you who come to class, there won't be class on Tuesday. For those of you, for everyone, on Thursday, we're actually going to start 2:30. And I know that kind of helps, but you'll still get out in the same time. You'll get out at 3:45. So we'll have a shorter class. I have to be in a webcam or like a WebEx or whatever until 2:15, and I'll probably be in this room. But unfortunately, what will happen is that you can't come in because I'm not allowed to discuss it in front of anything that I discuss about students. I can't discuss in front of other students. So I can't discuss in front of you. So I have to wait until that ends, and then I will bring you in. But the live stream will start at 2:30. The exam is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, right? It's a 72-hour window to take the exam. You are given 50 minutes. Anyone with DRC who feels like that I didn't check in with them, sort of email me. I should be able to set up different times in case you need extended time and something else, right? If you know right now that the exam is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday window, and you need an hour, you need 50 minutes, right? It takes 50 minutes to take the exam. If you know right now, or if you know in the next 24 hours that that's not going to work, that something is happening, that you've got to go help, right? I have a family member whose house burnt down, right? That some people are leaving right now to handle some other 2020 nonsense that it seems to be piling on this year, right? If you have something like, talk to me. Talk to me beforehand, right? I don't fix late, but I will help you in any way that I can if you ask me about early, right? If you're like, I have a problem that's coming up. And we just had the sun blocked out by smoke yesterday. We were going through a pandemic that's hopefully once a century, right? Everything is crazy right now. If you need me to do something to help you get to this exam, or if you need to be something set up, this is the one time in my entire career that I will change everything to fit with your schedules, that I will work with you. But if you don't take the exam, on Thursday, we're moving forward. There will be no makeups. There will be no sort of changing scores. That is the exam that you get. All right, so are there any questions right now? All right, so I'm gonna end the live stream and everyone can have a good day.